Here we are to chapter 7. Yeah, let's take a look at some of this stuff here. There we go. Now I can tell you I've only been at this teaching gig for about 15 years. And so I can beat that record, I'm sure. So, and yeah, we're going to talk about property and we've got real property, which is land and everything that's permanently attached to that land. Okay, and here's an example. An outhouse would be real property. Nobody wants to pull it up and carry it away anyhow. And of course the house here would be real property. The vehicles would not be, and the stuff on the porch would not be. But the beer would be personal property, right? And the basket and those types of things would all be personal property. Michael Jackson, by the way, yes, he was a great singer, but there was a Michael Jackson in the United Kingdom or Great Britain who wrote this column called The Beer Hunter. He's unfortunately passed away. I wrote and applied for his job. He wrote a column about beer where literally he was just a beer critic, and so he'd go out in the evenings and sample beer. Most of the pubs over there, kind of like the U.S. is getting back to, had their own beer, so he'd go sample their beers and then write about it. And I thought that would be a perfect job. I can't imagine hardly a better job, right? Personal property, things that move, right? Look at that. My wife always wanted a riding lawnmower, and I broke down finally. Got her one. Yeah, she was happy. Sure. Gave her that for our anniversary. Is it likely for a nation to be prosperous and maintain a vibrant market without having a strong... Say no. Okay. Worldwide, if you take a look at nations that do not have strong property rights, they're poor. There's no other way to put it, and there's really not much exception. Okay, they're poor. If there is exception, it would only be maybe a few small nations that have really vast natural resources, oil, those types of things. But yeah, for the most part, they are poor. Okay, and for the most part, nations that have strong private property systems are pretty wealthy. So. Okay, legal concept of property, right? Vital to understanding how law provides a foundation for the private market. Absolutely. So property means ownership, okay? An exclusive right in resources, again, be they real or personal, and the legal right to exclude or keep others from interfering. And of course, as with many of our rights, there are kind of limits or things that we look at, and they're not absolute, I guess would be probably a better way to say it. So yeah, so how do we order these things? How do we decide some of these things? And believe me, a lot of our law is based on this. And it's wonderful to own land. Let's say you own land in Havre. Okay, it's a nice little place, right? Do you want the people next door to be manufacturing fireworks? Maybe not. That might seem a little dangerous, right? And so, we can put restrictions on those types of things because, everybody needs to have equal, or not equal rights, but they need to have fair rights when it comes to those things. So we got the state that comes in to address problems of limited resources, and what do we do, right? We have state versus private property and legal frameworks, obviously, to address some of those problems that might come up. So property central, right? Promotes incentives, makes resources easily divisible, and the bottom one's probably even more important, establishes conditions for capital formation. The fact that we can accumulate property. Remember, money's a form of property as well. So we can accumulate property, be it money, be it personal property of other sorts, or be it real property. Okay. Basic division, real property and personal property. Okay. Real property is land and interests in land, okay? And everything permanently attached is considered real property. And personal property is basically everything else, okay? Movable, okay? So real property, real estate, it does require written agreements to transfer. You know, we talked about contracts, and contracts don't have to be. I think contracts are coming up actually, but contracts don't have to be in writing to be valid. But that's not so if we're talking about contracts for real property. Okay, they do have to be in writing to actually transfer the property. Okay, they do have to be in writing, and it includes fixtures. You know, unless otherwise noted. So, personal property is property that's not real property, and again, anything, right? Basically movable. It can be tangible, a vehicle, a bicycle, equipment, okay, those types of things. Intangible might be interests in, okay, these types of things, and it includes things, and we'll talk, we got a whole separate chapter, I think, where we talk about intellectual property, which are trade secrets, patents, trademarks, etc. But there again, there's restrictions. Okay, these rights are not absolute. Okay, and you know, think too of water. Okay, right, and if and this happened, I know, down by between Winifred and Lewistown, the Kendall mine, and what happened there is miners had rights to property to do mining, and they were doing cyanide leach mining. Well, they weren't mindful of their ponds, their leach ponds, and the water escaped, got into the creeks that went down to the landowners then below the mine, and it poisoned their water. So the cattle, you know, didn't have a place to drink, right? Unless they set up some alternate things, and I think they had to fence off the creeks because the cattle would die if they drank the water, on and on and on, right? So, you know, those aren't absolute, right? The people that are above that stream, they have a duty to not pollute the water, right? So we might call common property different things. In Montana, I put this in here, and this is just my opinion. Okay, this isn't necessarily anything I've read in law, but it's my opinion that streams are kind of considered common property. They're not owned. Okay, they travel through land, right, that's privately held, and yet everybody has access to it. Okay, access can't be denied to the streams. We deem those to be, again, they're not public property. They're not owned by the state. Okay, I own the property upon which a stream passes through, right? That's my property, and yet I'm obligated to allow people access to it. And so I've kind of defined that as being common property, and that's kind of in a real property sense. In personal property, you know, and again, I think intangible maybe Linux, those types of open source, you know, open source property that's available on the internet. Okay. We won't talk a ton about that. Public property we're all kind of familiar with, right? State, government types of lands, be it local, and there's local parks, right? There's a city or county. You know, we're in Hill County. We've got Beaver Creek Park, which is huge, you know, by park standards. And then you got state, all kinds of state property, and huge, vast tracts in Montana, huge, vast tracts of federal public property. Then, of course, we have private property, which is probably more what we'll be talking about. Tangible or intangible? Well, a certificate of ownership, right, is basically what a stock certificate is. It's a certificate of ownership in a company. It's intangible, right? You own a share of a company, but that's intangible. You can feel or touch the certificate, but you can't feel or touch really the property itself, you know, the ownership of the company. So real or personal? Again, personal. Okay, this is tangible. These guys don't look too excited. I'm just kind of amazed. They got their arms crossed, and that old boy's just hanging there, but oh well, I guess. So how do we acquire? The best way, of course, to acquire property is through gift. Somebody gives it to you. Well, that might be, maybe finding it would be as good. Exchange is probably what we talk more about in business, right? Exchange, buy, sell, barter, those types of things, right? A cession is when you add things to it, becomes a part of. let's say you go out to the farm and you buy an old rusted up um, pickup or something, right? And you bring it in and you restore it. And you're putting new parts on it. You're putting a new engine in it. You're putting those types of things, right? Okay, they become a part of that pickup then, right? You've got an interest in the pickup, and all of a sudden those things become a part of the pickup itself. Okay. So somebody that would have a lien on it would have a lien on all those parts, even though they were purchased separately and whatnot from the original purchase of the rusty old thing in the field, right? Through confusion, it's interesting. How can you get some property through confusion? It happens, and there's ways to divide it, and we talk about fungible property. Adverse possession is one that's also kind of interesting, and believe it or not, it actually happens, and we'll talk about all these and give you maybe some ideas of how they, what could be adverse possession. First possession, original possession. I've kind of looked those up, and I can't really distinguish between the two, and certainly I wouldn't on a test. I would call them similar things, right? First possession might be, or original possession, creation of artwork, for example, writing a song, those types of things. Copyrighted material, be it writing. Okay, that could be first possession. It's got a value. Okay. Software, right? Being the first person to create a software, right? You all of a sudden you've got some ownership in it. Original possession, again, kind of same thing, I think, and could also be, think back when they did homesteading and the land stuff that they did back then, could be that. So again, exchanging, we already kind of talked about that. Again, contract must be in writing if it involves real estate, not so if it involves personal property, right? Although there's exceptions to that as well. Possession, first possessions, inventors, creators. What about lost property? Montana, and I made a little reference here. I'm not going to click on it, but made a little reference to the Montana Code Annotated where it talks about lost property. And Montana, you've got an obligation. I think if it's over $20, you've got an obligation to try to track down the owner. Okay, in a reasonable fashion, right? That doesn't mean that you have to go to the ends of the earth and spend your entire life, trying to track down that owner. But it means that you have to do something that's kind of reasonable, and that might depend on, the value. If it's $25, you don't need to go run a $30 ad in the newspaper, right? That would be kind of ridiculous. But there's other things that you could do, right? And you could report it to the police department and those types of things. And I think also for some of that stuff, you could turn it over, like say to a police department, again depending on the value. And after a certain amount of time, then it would revert to you, the person that found it. Okay. Adverse possession, open and notorious, actual and exclusive, on and on and on. This has probably as much to do, think about things like easements maybe, right? And an easement is actually a property right. So, let's say I have 40 acres and my neighbor crosses that 40 acres to get to his or her property, and there may be other ways to get to his or her property, but crossing my 40 acres is the easiest, and they've been doing it for 30 years. Okay, it's open and notorious. I've known about it and I haven't stopped them. Okay, actual and exclusive, it improper, I guess, just in that it's not their property, right? Okay. It's continuous and it's for a period of time. Well, so I sell that 40 acres and the next owner comes in and puts up a fence and says you can't do that. Okay, the person would argue that no, they've got a right. They have an easement, basically an easement by prescription. It's also called, to cross that property, and they would have a legitimate argument. Some they win, some they lose. Don't get me wrong. It's not. Again, it's going to depend on how all of these things are outlined in a court, right, to determine whether or not they would actually be entitled to that possession. Okay, eminent domain is the public's right to condemn and take property for the good of the people, and I think maybe your guys' case, your assignment might have had to do with eminent domain, and it's kind of interesting, right? It does require fair market value remuneration, so people are paid. Okay, they don't just lose their property, but they get paid for it, but they can be forced to vacate property. And again, I think where this is getting kind of testy, I think in a legal sense, is that nobody denies the government the right to say take possession when they were building railroads and when they were building highways and doing those types of things, right? Or if the government has a specific need. Okay, we might even go so far as to like power transmission lines and things like that are obvious. Even though it's a private company, maybe it's a Northwestern or some company that's doing it. We all see the value of that. I guess it gets to be a little bit more questionable when you get maybe a city that invokes eminent domain, takes property from little old lady that's got a house on Main Street because a guy wants to build a Mercedes dealership there. Okay, and there are examples of those types of things, exactly those types of things happening. Okay, and that gets to be pretty testy. What right should the government have, and does that really serve the public good? And arguments can be made on both sides. And so, I don't have a position. Some of them I read and I get totally teed off, and then other times I read it and I think about it and I go, well, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. So, okay. Acquiring property can also be through confusion, right? Fungible assets are those that are easily mixed. Think grain, maybe, and it all gets dumped, okay, and the elevator loses track or whatever, kind of, they might lose track of who dropped off what grain, right? And it ends up getting mixed. And one farmer says he had 13 protein, and the other farmer says he had 13 protein, right? And it averages out at 12 protein. Well, again, what they would do then is just do a pro rata share, probably whatever that may be, and they would, whatever the average protein was for the two, they'd probably just have to pay it out in that sense. And that's just one example of fungible assets. And there's others, not a lot. You don't see a lot of use of that. And so, gift, there does have to be intent for gift, and that you get a lot of that, with wills and protesting wills, and etc. That they're there has to be intent. And did the old guy, when he was losing his mind, or the old gal when she was losing her mind, did she really intend to give that property to her nurse, or his or her nurse, for the last 20 years? Yeah, maybe. And there must be delivery. Delivery can be signing of deeds, those types of things for real property. Personal property can be, a little more subtle, just handing it over, right? Depending on the personal property. So real property and ownership of real property, and there's probably more on the test of this than what you guys would like, but it's kind of important. I spent a decent amount of my banking career dealing with, property, real estate, especially financing it and doing those types of things. So it's important to kind of know these things. So fee simple absolute is property that doesn't have any conditions attached, right? Fee simple defeasible may have conditions attached, for example, set aside for conservation. We're seeing more of this, right? We've seen some local farmers. I know some. There were some when I was in banking, and I've seen some newspaper articles or other articles kind of relating to this, where farmers would sell conservation rights for their property. They would often maintain the physical property, okay, but basically it becomes a restrictive covenant on the usage then of that property. Okay, maybe it can't be subdivided, maybe it can't be farmed, right? It's got to be maintained for cattle grazing because that benefits sage grouse or something like that. Okay, so there's getting to be more and more of this. So we're seeing a lot of property that probably is fee simple, defeasible, but most of the ag property and whatnot that we'd see are probably fee simple absolute. Okay, life estates, and this is kind of important, right? It conveys property until the end of a person's natural life. So let's say that a couple things we could do here, right? I could say that I'm going to donate some property to the college, but not until I die. Okay. Then the college would have a future interest, so I got to bounce down here. They would have they'd be the holder of a remainder interest, right? Okay, because they're a separate party that will receive ownership upon death. Okay, so they would have a future interest in that property, and their interest would be a remainder interest, right? The reversion interest would be, let's say I had some property, maybe my mom, and she is getting elderly, and I wanted her to have a nice place to live, and I want her to take care of it. She should pay the taxes and those kinds of things on it. So I could deed it to her as a life estate again for her. And then I would retain a reversion interest, right? So the property would return to me upon mom's death in that case, assuming I outlived her. Okay, so those are life estates. They're pretty widely used, actually. So leasehold is actually a property, right? Okay, you guys have, if you're staying at the dorms, right, you're leasing it from the college, and you've got certain rights in that, right? Right to privacy and different things like that. Ownership of real property. Okay, tenants in common is most often, this is what's kind of important, most often used with unrelated property, because my partner and I, we own some property together, right? And we each want our share of that to go to our heirs should something happen to us. Well, we would have that as tenants in common then, right? Joint tenants typically equal shares, and ours are equal shares too. Okay, a joint tenant right of survivorship is what's more common, and that is married couples or maybe parents and children would set up joint tenants right of survivorship. So if one person dies, the interest automatically goes to the other person. I see more tenants in common in JTROS. I don't see just plain joint tenants, I guess, all that often. I guess it's equal shares, and it can be. I suppose you could use this with unrelated parties, and it would be okay. But I've always seen that as being tenants in common, I guess. So deeds, again, this is pretty important. A warranty deed is probably the most common form of transference. Okay. You want property to be free of encumbrance other than those noted, because property gets transferred sometimes with an easement on it or some things like that. And so there can be some encumbrances, or it might get transferred with some debt. Okay, and that can happen depending. Okay, this is again unrelated people generally use a warranty deed to transfer property from one unrelated person to another. Quitclaim deeds are without warranty. Okay, and I put in here, it's often used with family transfers. If I was going to give some property to my son, okay, I would simply use a quitclaim deed. He's going to have to trust me, I guess, that it's free and clear of encumbrances. Okay, what this usually entails when you do a warranty deed is you have to prove it. They usually use title insurance to prove it. A quitclaim deed, it'd be, tough luck, buddy. I'm giving it to you. I guess be happy if there's some encumbrances on it. That's your own. You're gonna have to figure that out, right? Okay. I see quitclaim deeds often used in cases of divorce, right? So people are getting divorced. One party is going to get the house, so the other party needs to sign it over. Both parties should be aware of any encumbrances that are on there, and so a quitclaim deed would often be used. So, yeah. In Montana, any transactions like that have to be recorded at the county where the property is located. Using real property, this is real property for collateral, right? A mortgage is generally used for large parcels. Generally, it can be used for smaller parcels, but almost always it's always used for large parcels, okay, and seldom used for smaller parcels would be a better way to say that. Trust indentures and deeds of trust, okay, and the difference between them is not enough to worry about. So think of these two as the same: trust indentures and deeds of trust, okay. And what happened is, generally for years and years and years, mortgage was the primary way that banks or lending institutions took security interest in any property. Okay, and it became cumbersome. The foreclosure process and whatnot is more cumbersome with larger tracts or with mortgages. And so banks lobbied, and they said, we would make more loans to people for homes and those types of things if it were a little bit easier to foreclose. Sounds kind of evil, but it's not. It has opened it up and made it easier then for banks and lending institutions to lend money to people. And So they divided that up, and they said, well, we don't want family farms, we don't want you to be able to easily foreclose on them, but for homes and those types of things under 40 acres, yeah, we can use either a trust indenture or a deed of trust. And basically what it does, so is it sets aside that property, or that property is held in trust by a third party, a title company or something like that. It's just held in trust, okay, until it's either paid off or until a foreclosure happens, okay. And then if it's paid off, then the trustee, at that time, in essence, deeds the property to the buyers, okay, or the people that have been paying on it. And if they foreclose, then basically the trustee gives the property back to the person that financed it, okay, the bank or the other lending institution or whoever might have financed that property, okay. And the process is easier than going through a mortgage foreclosure. And again, those docs have to be filed with the appropriate county. So limitations on property. Right? Private property has limits, absolutely. It's always subject to the rights of others. Again, going back to my example of poisoning a creek. Okay, there's things like eminent domain, and there's things like taxation. So we've decided that we can tax property, be it real or personal in some cases. When you license your car, basically that's a tax. Some of it that you're paying is a tax, right, for owning that vehicle. Okay, and we've decided that that's okay. Get back again. Nuisance, right? Use of land that causes inconvenience or damage to the public, right? In a public sense, in a private sense, unreasonable use of one's property so as to cause interference with enjoyment or use of another's land. Okay, so this would be the poisoning, right? The water downstream. This might be more general, right? So you're creating a nuisance that's bothering everybody. Put up a incinerator or something, and you're burning and causing smoke to fill everybody's lungs in a 2-block area, right? And these are still enforceable in courts, okay, in a lot of cases. So zoning's important. Okay, zoning's very, very important in cities and communities and counties and those types of things. And zoning, if you take a look and you look up properties and see who owns it, by the way, you can do that at the Montana Cadastral Mapping Project. And it should tell you, I think, on there how a property might be zoned, be it maybe residential, be it commercial, be it, I think they break it down into light commercial. Residentials are limited, they could be, some manufactured homes, mobile homes, manufactured homes in some areas of town. In other areas of town, those might not be allowed, might be a little more, if you own a nice house that you paid $350,000 for, you don't necessarily want a mobile home being moved in next to it, okay? And so zoning does that. And commercial, same thing. There's light commercial, so even and you're in certain areas of town, maybe where there's a lot of residences even, it might be okay to have a little craft shop or something like that, or it might be okay to have your accounting office there. Okay, those types of things are probably not going to bother anybody. Okay, on the other hand, to have a auto repair shop there, yeah, maybe not so good, right? And so there's regulations of zoning. Okay, it limits right to the use of it and to the aesthetics. We want to know those types of things, and there can be variances to zoning. So I've seen that in terms of building setbacks. I think in Havre, buildings have to be set back 8 or 10 feet from property lines, and oftentimes, however, it just isn't practical. That just doesn't work. If you want to put in a shed even or something like that, so you might have to get a variance, and you can do that. If the property, if it's reasonable, if it's not going to offend the neighbors, usually the neighbors have to sign off and whatnot. You can get variances. Restrictive covenants are when I'll think of this in terms of development. If somebody's developing a neighborhood, okay, and restrictive covenants are very legitimate. They may for example, say that all homes in this area have to have grass lawns. I know that may sound stupid, but some places may want that, right? So that it keeps up a certain appearance. Okay. This isn't really relevant anymore, but just to the east of our hospital here, there's an edition called the Century Edition. Well, way back when they were being developed, the reason it got called the Century Edition was because the restrictive covenant there was building a house had to cost, the house itself had to be valued at least $100,000, hence the century, right? And again, they just wanted people to be building places that were nice and that kind of fit into that particular neighborhood. Okay, $100,000 doesn't buy much anymore, but at the time it seemed like quite a deal. Used to be a real blemish on the history because restrictive covenants back in before the Civil Rights Act were used to exclude minorities. Okay, absolutely, they just have restrictive covenants that say, no minorities in this particular area of town. So it was pretty ugly. Civil rights, of course, took that away. So easements, I talked a little bit about easements and legal right of passage across land, and that's not just for driving across it. Think of all the power lines, pipelines, those types of things. I think there was some discussion about pipeline and whatnot in there. Somebody put in there too, I kind of want to address that about pipelines, worried about pipeline going underneath the Missouri River and how it might have consequences. But you need to know that there are probably, at this point in time, hundreds of pipelines that go underneath the Missouri River, from Three Forks all the way down to where it goes into the Missouri. It could be thousands that are already existing underneath the river. I mean, there are pipelines all over the place. For the most part, don't cause any harm, but occasionally they do. Bailments, just good placed into another's possessions to be returned in the future. So you're paying somebody to store, maybe. Okay, pay somebody to store and take care of your property, right? Fifth Amendment, right? In Fifth Amendment, we think about invoking your fifth or not providing testimony that might incriminate yourself, but it's also got this eminent domain thing in it. It says government can take private property for public use. Again, there has to be just compensation, market value. A jury may be needed to determine that. And, look up some cases because some of them are really interesting. Some of them you would think are diabolical, and when you read it, and others, you might think are diabolical, and then if you read a little bit more, you might discover that maybe it's not so much. And again, I get in the middle. I mean, I can read one case and I read it three different ways and get three different opinions about what I think, I guess, about that particular case, and there's good arguments, I think, on both sides when it comes to using it for private uses. And again, I'd go back, while we might not like the idea of taking old ladies' property, so Donald Trump even could build a casino, right, or put in a Mercedes dealership or whatever. We don't really think twice about it for putting in a pipeline. I mean, across our country, believe me, we've got power lines, pipelines, and those types of things that would never have been built had we not had eminent domain, right? Even though it was private companies that benefited from it. Okay, and so the argument there can be sometimes that we can't move forward with some of these things unless we allow for that. Here I'm going to make several arguments myself and confuse myself again as to where I stand on some of those. So taxation, I don't think we're going to have much on that on the test, but basically our money is personal property, right? And we've got real property that gets taxed, and other property like vehicles and those types of things that gets taxed too. And so the government taking that is a restriction on our property rights. And so basically that's kind of all we're saying there. Secure transactions, and again, this is what we did with personal property. A ton of this at the bank, again, right? Security interest in personal property can be given as collateral, vehicles loan, right? Or mobile homes, boats, RVs, those types of things, right? Can be given as collateral. And there's an attachment of a lien. Know that term? I don't know that we have that in here, but a lien, L-I-E-N. Okay, can be filed on property, and is, and it's perfected through, we call it a financing statement. We use financing statements when we were talking about non-titled equipment. A lot of equipment, loaders, tractors that farmers have, combines, those types of things that we took security interest in. They don't have titles because they're typically not on the roads, right? So they don't need a title. And so we did that through financing statement. There's actually a whole nother procedure for titled vehicles, which includes cars. It includes some road-worthy four-wheelers, those types of things. Also includes mobile homes are titled, okay? And so those have a way to perfect a lien otherwise, besides a financing statement. A PMSI, or purchase money security interest, and the reason that's important is that can have priority. Okay, a purchase money security interest can have priority if there's some other liens that end up being on the property, even if they were there ahead of time. And there's also other priorities for liens, and it gets to be pretty complicated. I don't know how much I might have put on the test. Probably not a ton, but we'll answer this question. Does secured interest that are recorded first in time always take priority over competing interest recorded later? The answer is no. Okay, and the reason for that is mechanics liens are a good example. So a mechanic, you might have your car financed through the bank. Okay, and you owe the bank $5,000. You take it into the mechanic and you ask him to do some work, and he does $500 worth of work. You don't pay him, and he keeps your vehicle, and it stays down there for 30 days, and there's time limits, maybe 60 days, and then he can file a mechanics lien. Okay, and his mechanics lien is going to have preference. Okay, he'll get paid first if he ultimately sells that vehicle. Okay, he would get paid his $500 first, and then the rest would go to the bank in that case. Generally, so what would happen in that case is the bank would go in and just pay him off and repossess the vehicle and sell it and try to recoup what they could. Okay, because they'd want to have control over the transaction. So priority is can be confusing at times. I don't think I would ask a lot of questions about that on the test. So, okay, yeah, imagine that, living in a society where you didn't have that. We just take it for granted here that we've got real and personal property rights, and you should wake up every day and thank God that you live in a nation that has these types of rights, because the vast majority of people in the world don't have them to the extent that we do. You get a China that's starting to come around, and in India maybe coming around a little bit, but that's about a third of the world's population, and they don't have property rights anywhere nearly as established and protected as ours are. So there you have it. All right, we'll sign out. Thanks for listening.